Welcome. My name is Dan Allen. I'm the Associate Dean at Chicago Harris, the Public Policy School at the University of Chicago. And I'm really delighted to welcome you not only to this session, but to Alumni Weekend. So great to have our alumni back in Chicago, back in Hyde Park, and even better to have you back in the classroom as it is. And in this case, spending some time with two important teachers and researchers at Chicago Harris who are going to talk about the intersection of data science and public policy. And we all know that there's so much in the news today about big data and the types of data that businesses and governments and other sectors of our economy are collecting about us. But at Chicago Harris, we're keen to understand how these data can be used to inform effective public policy. And so in that regard, I'd like to introduce Professor Chris Berry. Chris not only is a faculty member at Chicago Harris, but he is an alumnus of the University of Chicago. Chris is the director of our Center for Municipal Finance at Chicago Harris. He's interested, of course, in municipal finance, but also in a number of governance issues that are related to major cities around the world. In addition to directing the Center for Municipal Finance and his research, Chris is also the academic director of a new center that we have at Chicago Harris and a new degree program that we have at Chicago Harris that's looking at computation and public policy. So Chris will speak first, and he'll be followed by his colleague, Brett Goldstein. Brett is a senior fellow at Chicago Harris. Brett came to Chicago Harris as part of a major grant that was provided to the school by the MacArthur Foundation that is enabling Brett and the school to study urban science. Before coming to Harris, Brett was the Chief Information Officer, Chief Data Officer, both of those positions for the city of Chicago. Also a University of Chicago alumnus, and also has the distinction of being one of the founders of OpenTable before he began his government career and before he then went into academia. So really delighted that we're able to share the expertise of Chris and Brett. Following their talk, then we'll facilitate questions and answers with all of you. So Chris, I believe you're going first.
All right. Thank you, Dan. Hello, everybody, and welcome back. It's great to see you here. I see a few familiar faces who I may have even taught in this room. This is where I teach one of my big classes. So Dan already kind of described to you the main title and subject we're going to talk about, which has to do with data and public policy and computation. And to a large extent, this idea of data-driven policy is not new. In fact, those of you who are familiar with the Harris School know that we sort of made our name over the last 20 years or so as being the most data-driven, the most quantitative of the major policy schools. And so when we start talking about, oh, there's a new program having to do with data and policy, the initial reaction is, well, what to do about that? That sounds like Harris has always done. And one of the phrases that comes to mind when we talk about new, when we talk about data, people want to talk about big data. Oh, about big data. And I'll tell you, if you have any idea what big data means, you're way ahead of most people who use that term because nobody really knows. I'll give you just a plausible definition of what big data is and then tell you that that has absolutely nothing to do with what we're doing here. To the extent that big data means something is really within computer science, there is an expression, there is a field of concern with big data which has to do with data that is too big to be stored on one machine or data that's too big to be read into memory by one machine at one time. This is actually, first of all, a meaningful definition of big data, right, is one that varies over time, right, as our computational capacity increases. What was big data a year ago is no longer big data. But for computer scientists, this is an important area of inquiry because it does pose lots of analytical problems. Like you want to analyze some data, you can't get it all in the same machine even at once, or you can't get it all in the memory at once. How are you going to analyze it? You want to do some sort of social network analysis, but half your data is on this machine, half the data is on that machine. Okay, so computer scientists are working on that. It's important. It's what big data actually means. It's not what anybody means when they say big data for the most part. And really, that bears very little relationship to what we're going to be talking about here. There is big data used in public policy according to the definition I gave you, but not that much, and it's not really the important thing. So what is different, and why do we saying we have something new? It's not about big data. I think there are three things that are changed relatively fundamentally in the last decade or so about the way data are used in a policymaking process. They correspond with how data are used in business setting, and they're largely the motivation for what we're going to be doing. So let me tell you what these three things are. First is what I will call datafication, or the transformation of information that existed for a long time that we've never thought of before as being data into a form that can be used as data. So think about all the things that we consider data now. Text is data. So all the published records of all the newspapers in the world are data. All the speeches on the floor of the city council data. Anything that's in a print form on a piece of paper can these days be digitized and turned into data, and we might never have thought of using that before. Images are now data. So we have colleagues who use, for instance, street-level photographs to translate that into a form of data that can be computerized to ask questions about, well, what's the quality of the neighborhood, or how well maintained is this neighborhood? We can quantify that using images. We can use satellite images to analyze land cover and make extrapolations of urban growth over time by using views from space and changing their images into pixels, which we can code into, well, what land cover must be there given the value of this pixel, okay? One sort of interesting example of this datafication phenomenon came up to me when I was at a conference a month or two ago in New York, and people were talking about trying to create the fully instrumented city. With a fully instrumented city, meaning we could measure pretty much everything going on in the city at any given time using various kinds of sensors. And so some sensors you may be already familiar with. We have, red light cameras around the city of Chicago that are constantly taking photographs of people, and you can think of that can be used to give you that ticket that you went through the red light, but also captured as an image to use as data to talk about the flow of traffic. We can put sensors on streets that monitor the pedestrian and traffic flows. One of these groups that I was talking to at this conference said, well, we're in the process now in New York, we're going to start putting sensors in all the sewers. I said, why are you doing that? They said, what are you talking about? Why are we doing that? We can tell you about drug use. We can tell you about child nutrition, all in real time. Why? Because they can monitor the actual, content of the sewer, the refuse, to say, like, what proportion of people on this block are using drugs. And they can do this in real time. And they can tell you about childhood nutrition, all from these kind of sensors that are monitoring that. So when I talk about datafication, I'm talking about using all kinds of things we never historically have thought about as being data, including sewage, now becoming a form of data. Okay, so this is trend one that I say is really changing the way public policy is operating, also businesses. Secondly, is the speed with which we can do this. Okay? As I said, policy for a long time has been data-driven and influenced by data, but the time frame with which we would use our data has accelerated dramatically. So it used to be, we want to know, there's some policy we're concerned about, and we say, we need some data on this. We want to see, in a quantitative, evidence-driven way, how we might want to change our policy. Well, you'd start with a data collection phase, and that could take weeks or months, and then some analysis phase, or maybe you'd need to run a randomized trial, and you'd have to set that up and recruit people. And so there was a lag between sort of asking a question, right, some question that required data to answer it, and getting an answer that could be months or years long. Now, we're talking about the ability to constantly have data at our fingertips, to answer questions quickly, and that we might say, your boss might say to you, I want to know the answer to this particular question, some evidence on this, in an hour, by the end of the day. Certainly we're not going to say, in months from now, I'll be happy to know the answer to this question I had back in December. Okay, I want to know the answer now. So the speed and the quantity of data that we can deal with is really changing fundamentally just the way in which we have to relate to the data. Not just the data being readily accessible, but our ability to analyze it immediately, not over the course of months. And then third is the demand for the data. So it used to be you would go do this study or randomized trial or whatever kind of study you might do, and it would take you months, and you turn in this report to somebody, and it might or might not filter its way up the food chain for someone ever learning about it. Now you're in a world where the sort of younger and more cutting-edge managers, they themselves are demanding this data. They want to see it. They want to know what you're doing. Okay, and they don't want to just have it filtered out to them, months later about what happened to that randomized trial. They want the answer right now. And the public, secondly. So policymakers and the public. So this move towards transparency, the expectation that you as a member of the public can know what your government is doing, what policies are being made, and how they're being done. So, 311 calls being digitized and put on the web immediately, things like that. Brett can talk a lot more about these kind of things. But so the demand from policymakers and the public to have access to the data in there. So these three things, datafication, speed, and demand, have really changed the way in which data is influencing public policy relative to even, as I said, a decade ago when Harris School was already doing a lot of data-driven policy, but not in this kind of environment. And so these changes led us at Chicago Harris, at the university more broadly, to begin thinking about how we might need to train our students differently from how we've historically trained. And one of the areas where we saw greatest need was in computation. Okay, a lot of the things that I'm talking to you about, what makes them different is our ability to use computational analysis and computer technology to access and analyze data on a wide scale and quickly. And I can't remember now exactly when Brett and I originally met, but it was a while back and before we created this program. But there was a conversation he and I had when he was the CIO of the city of Chicago. And we were talking about, well, where do you get your people? Where do you get people that work for you, that have the skills that you need? And he was commenting that there really wasn't, at that time, any program producing such people who had this intersection of skills in computation and public policy together. And so that led me to think, to talk to colleagues on campus, could we put this together? And so what we formed at Chicago is a joint degree, fully joint between the Harris School and the Department of Computer Science. Okay? And the students, this degree is called CAP, for Computational Analysis and Public Policy. And the students in this degree, they take the full core of the policy degree and a full core of a master's in computer science. So this is not one of these, one-year quickie degrees. This is a very intense degree where you have to, in fact, do both things and do them both well and at a high level. And upon doing that, they specialize in either some aspect of computation or some aspect of policy. So they might go off to be an expert in databases, or they may go off to be an expert in education policy as they choose. But the key thing is to produce students who have enough expertise in both fields that they can go off and work for people like Brett and ultimately become people like Brett with any luck. So we're doing that. In addition, we're launching, or have launched last year, a summer program. So the program I described for you is an actual degree program, a master's degree. We've launched a summer program where we bring people from around the country in just for the summer to give them an intense training in this approach to the world and put them on applied projects very quickly. Rayid Ghani, who is supposed to be here with us today, runs that program, wasn't able to join us because of a small crisis they had. It's the first week of this year's program, and it turns out they have no internet access. And when you're running, a bleeding edge program in computational analysis, it turns out it looks better if you can get online. So Ray's down there solving that problem. He sends his apologies. But this is a summer program that allows to get students. They're not full-time UChicago students. They come from all over the country to come and spend a summer here and get some intense training. So this training mission is supporting efforts also to take these ideas onto the research side. So we've got a new center jointly run by Rayid and myself that is in this data science and public policy, and we're trying to support research and faculty who are working in these areas and also applied project works, because the goal here is not simply purely an intellectual one, but to train people who go out in the world and do stuff. And I think this is really, really important. These students that we're training will be, as far as I know, among the first that have gotten this particular combination of approaches. And there's some interesting sort of intellectual tensions for them that makes this interesting if you're at a place like Chicago, where you've got different paradigms of thinking about the world. So you've got people like the classic sort of Harris School approach to the world, which is you want to know an answer, you want to do causal inference, you're going to do a randomized trial, you're going to do this kind of things. For people who are interested in things like statistical learning and data mining, who think, well, maybe we can learn an awful lot from correlations, we don't need randomized trials, let's see what we can extract from data. Very different intellectual approaches that I think for a student is going to be a real challenge to master and kind of understand when and how to use these things and not misuse them. And for us, sort of intellectually as faculty members, to begin thinking about how to bring these ideas together in our own research and such is important. So that's what makes this both a training opportunity, I think, for students and an interesting intellectual opportunity for the faculty. Now, as I said, this program originated with the goal of training students to go out in the world and do stuff. And we have, in order to accomplish that goal, we have recruited a group of accomplished folks to help us, and none more accomplished than the man sitting over here to my left, Brett Goldstein. And rather than my trying to tell you how to go out in the world and do stuff, which I know relatively little about, I'm going to turn this over to Brett and let him tell you about his own experiences.
Great. So I'm going to be much more casual and laid back. I think Chris is more animated, so I'll stay right here. So I think I'll start by telling you a story from a year ago that sort of illustrates the point. So it was probably 13 months ago. I was still CIO of the city, also CDO, and I was sitting, I had a great office. Like, I had the best commissioner's office, 27th floor, 50 West Washington, looked out on the lake, had my own bathroom. Great, great, awesome. So it's 6 o'clock at night. A lot of work, as people know, in government, you know, you have meetings all day and then you start working through things in the evening. So I'm looking out on the lake, and I'm looking at Lakeshore Drive, and I became curious. I was watching the buses go up and down, and sort of the CSE side and sort of the quant side of me said, I wonder how fast the buses usually go. And then I realized, wow, I have all that data because we had built a system that collects all sorts of spatial data. And one of the things that I don't know if people know, but on all city assets that are mobile, we have a GPS transponder. It calls in every 30 seconds. And back in the day, it would just be stored for a bit, then it would go off to archive. But one of my things is, I'll be honest with you, I'm a bit of a data hoarder, is I said we're going to build out a spatial system and collect things, and we're just not going to throw it out. So I logged into the system, and I did a quick count on how much GPS data I had there. And it was about 1 billion pieces of data. So that's actually kind of interesting. Not big, because we're not talking about big data today, even though the sign says we are. But now imagine if you wanted to, back in the day, do a quick little distribution on this, where you're going to say, I have 1 billion rows of CTA data. I want to look at some specific routes, then I want to look at the speeds, and then I want to do some descriptive statistics on this. So if someone here says that they could spin up their laptop, flip on stat or SPSS or even R, which I like quite a bit, and calculate that efficiently, I'll take you out to dinner, but you're still lying. And that's the interesting thing. So right then I wanted to look at that problem, so I wrote a quick little program. It was like 10 lines of code. It ran for, I think, 47 minutes, 53 minutes, just humor me. And then I actually got the distribution of all the buses that went on Lakeshore Drive. And let's just say it was interesting. But I had that data then and now. And those are problems that you can actually start to solve easily when you leverage some of the skills that come out of it's not just computer science, it's some of the more modern data science techniques. You talk about big data, NoSQL, MapReduce, some of these things, and you have answers in your hands. A problem which 5 years ago would have gone out to a consultant, taken 4 weeks, cost a fortune for the city to give me this much data, I solved on my own using city resources, using modern techniques, and we got answers. A silly example of a Goldstein evening activity, yet showing the types of things that you can solve when you have the data and you know how to use it. So I appreciate the intro. One of the things that's interesting that was left out when I left, so I left OpenTable in 2006. So imagine leaving West Coast startup, you know, jeans, t-shirt, evolving company. It was a multinational at that point. And then I decided to go work for the city. The agency I worked for initially was the police department. And I spent 5 years in the police department, and talk about interesting problems with data. But talk about a shift between going from the West Coast San Francisco OpenTable to the second biggest police department in the US, which is a bureaucracy that's been around for some time. And beyond that, think about just how our approach has typically been to crime data. Like it's really not terribly modern. So then take all that and think about what is the opportunity when you start to think about data differently. and you leverage different techniques for policing. And this gets us to the idea of how do you make government smarter? And it's really easy to talk about data-driven decisions and smarter government. That's usual political rhetoric nonsense. It's a different thing when you actually, to quote an article in the Financial Times, bring the geeks into government and start to look at some real things. So I spent my 5 years at the police department, and then I was actually sneaking off to another startup, which was going to be super awesome. And then Mayor Emanuel got elected. And I got a phone call to come down to the transition headquarters, and I talked to a team and I talked to the mayor, and they pitched me on this idea of doing government differently using data. And it was in a couple ways. One, they had heard that I had been leveraging data at the police department in more of a real-time tactical way. Two, they had been hearing, Google's using all this data to figure this out, and LinkedIn and Facebook, and all of these different companies are doing this. Why is government so far behind? So do business smarter. Then, the idea of transparency with data, as Chris spoke to, the idea of open data. So for those of you that might not realize, Chicago has had a bit of a history of being a little less than transparent. So Mayor Emanuel, it was interesting on the campaign trail, and I actually had to Google this after the fact because I'm not very political, talked about, he said, I want change transparency in Chicago, and I want open data to be part of it, and I want to leverage technology. So they pitched me on this, and I'm like, well, where's the team? And they're like, you're the team. And I'm like, okay. And I took the job. They're like, you can be the first chief data officer of a major municipality. And so the things that we found were, in fact, we could make government smarter. Now, the baseline had challenges. Like back when we first started, one of the areas of interest I have is in spatial data. Tell me the story about place. Now, in the way it was in government is if you wanted to know the story of 121 North LaSalle, so the address of City Hall. What would happen? So the chief of staff would either have his or her assistant start calling commissioners, or maybe an email would go out saying, give me everything you have on 121 North LaSalle. And then you have the licensing folks and the emergency management and the PD and all that. They call up their computer guy and they say, run a report. And then, so someone runs a report, turns into a PDF, it gets printed out, goes into an inter-office memo, and then it all comes back to chief of staff as a stack of different reports. It's this epitome of siloed information in government, yet we know, as we're all super smart people in this room, the problems are interdisciplinary. And yet we operate in these silos, and yet government had no perception because honestly, when they started to build out IT 20 years ago, there wasn't this idea that departments would have to talk to each other. So one of the things that was very interesting that we did in the first couple of years of Mayor Emanuel's administration is data unification, where we focused on breaking down the walls of data and bringing them together into a single system so that it was super easy to be able to tell the story of 121 North LaSalle, and even better, to tell it fast. Chris talked about sort of like providing data efficiently. It wasn't acceptable in a modern administration to say, yeah, I'm going to get back to you in 2 weeks and send you the report. It was, we need the information in an hour. And by unifying these data sources, we found that became very realistic. And it wasn't terribly hard, but you needed to have that computer science and technical intelligence within government to be able to provide candid, honest advice instead of the typical model of let's issue an RFP and find out, or let's get a consultant. It's embedding the knowledge within. At the same time, we found that open data opened, I guess that's funny, all sorts of doors. Now, one of the things we did early on in the summer of 2011 was release all the crime data. And that's certainly a data set that had a lot of interest to me from where I came from. Historically, Chicago would show you the past 90 days of crimes on a map on the PD site. And if you were really, really smart, you could write a piece of software and scrape it off the site, and then you could just every day get a little more, and then maybe if you were lucky, you'd get up to 110 days of crime data. Now, this was very counterintuitive as to why we would release data that way. So in overnight, we, well, there's 3 months of planning, but eventually overnight, we released all crime data from January 1, 2001 to, at that point, summer of 2011. And that was almost 5 million rows of data. And right then, that changed the dynamic. Because one, you gain transparency. When systems automatically dump data onto a system externally without human intervention, you gain that. Two, you're able to provide more general information to the public. The Chicago Tribune built an application which took all of that raw data and made it into the Chicago Tribune Crime App. You can find out all the information about your neighborhood. But the third piece, which is more subtle, is it empowered research. Instead of issuing FOIAs and NDAs and all of these different pieces, like I remember the day after the data went out, I started hearing from researchers. They're like, "Dear Brett, you changed my life. Love, researcher." And that was really nice. And what did it cost us? It didn't. And all the data's out there. And in the past couple of years, Chicago went from really releasing nothing except via FOIA to being the biggest open data city in arguably the world. And so we started to see we can release this data. We had all of this data that if we started to unify, we could find out. But how did we start to learn from it? And that actually takes us to the idea of, how do we grow more talent in this space? So I think we've seen early inroads into how you can do business smarter. Like one of the projects, so the project I did at the police department was predicting where homicide would occur. How do you listen to signal in the ecosystem, in my case it was via 911, and say, you're probably going to have an event? Or more recently, we've been looking at the 311 system and saying, what events precede other events? Are there early indications, and the one that's gotten all the press in Chicago, that you're going to have a rodent outbreak? What are early indicators of that? Because if you look at 311 in its aggregate, it is the majority of service requests for the city. And when you have an $8 to $9 billion budget, obviously the large portion of that is salary, but if you can do things more efficiently, it is fiscally smarter, it's also a better resident experience. Similar to the medical model, if you prevent rather than react, we're all happier. So you start to find these patterns, but we're at the beginning of this. Now, the piece that ties back to the CAP program is how do we sort of grow the crop of the next generation of government workers? So people who go in today into administrations like this, the requirements are different. We've created systems that have an enormity of data, which require fast tactical knowledge with strategic implications. And they need to be able to navigate between the intelligence and strategy of public policy, but the nimbleness and the technology that you need to work in data science. Because that's the new administration. That's what you saw with Mayor Bloomberg. That's what you saw with Mayor Emanuel. That's what you see with the president when you look at some of the presidential innovation fellows. This is where the world is going. There's much less patience for we're going to take the data and look at it for 2 years and then come back to you with what is a very good publishable study, but is not operationally and politically useful. There's actually much more of a tolerance for error in data. One of the discussions that's really interesting is tolerance for dirty data. Because when you're doing decision support And you need to know which, what are the things that can indicate or push me in the right direction. Okay, if you have 5 million rows of data and you have some naughtiness in there, can you work through it? The old way was, oh, dirty data, we need to throw it all out or just follow all these rules. That has changed. So there's a real opportunity to do government smarter. There is a real focus on decreasing the gap between the private sector and the public sector. There was a joke that used to get no tolerance with me when I was a commissioner. Government is, there were two things that were said. One, government would be behind the private sector by 10 years in tech. How can that be okay? What higher calling or duty is there in government? Or even worse, and this is how you get fired with me, good enough for government work. Like, the enormity of the responsibility makes the level of skills we need so much higher. And we have really passionate people who want to serve in government now. And as the program trains them to give them these real skills, this is where government's going. So it's really exciting to be at U of C at this point, because we're really a first of its kind. And we're fortunate to be in the position where we have very supportive academia. We also have a very supportive partner in the city, where there's a close relationship, there's data constantly coming out, and there's a real opportunity to do things smarter. Good idea.
Yeah. That's terrific. Thanks, Brett and Chris. So we want to give you an opportunity now for questions. Have some conversation with Brett and Chris. A few rules, I guess. One, there is a microphone, so if you could wait to ask your question until you get the microphone. Second, it's important, in fact, that you have a question and not a speech. I know there are a lot of bright people here, and so if you have something that you'd like to share next year at UnCommon Corp, submit your proposal, and we'd be delighted to have you come and give a talk. But for now, it's important that it's a question, and to the extent that you can be efficient with your question so that we can get to as many questions as there are, that would be terrific. So with that.
I'm fortunate enough to work in government and also unfortunate enough to work in government. And it sounds to me like you guys are going to generate a wonderful group of incredibly talented people with a multi-varying skill set. And I guess the challenge that we always face is, okay, but those people won't come work for us because we can't pay anything like it, and because, for better or for worse, at least in the agencies that I work with, we are 5 years minimum behind the tech backbone. So how do you surmount those difficulties in the absence of somebody coming in with a flaming sword to burn it down and say this shall be the case, which you may get idiosyncratically in different municipalities with a different mayor or a different president, but with a more entrenched institutional government enterprise, how do you break through the funding problems and those kinds of problems to get to the point where you can hire these folks and do these kinds of models?
So when the mayor made me CIO and I looked at making some senior level changes, everyone within my organization, everyone told me I was crazy, because they said no one's going to come work for you. You should just sort of keep the lines, is sort of the expression. And so I took that as a challenge, and I'm kind of spiteful that way. And what I did is I hit the street, and I started going to meetups. I started going to informal tech groups and whatever. And I'm fortunate that, one, I have a bit of street cred from the whole open table thing and sort of going into government. But when I pitched people, what I said to them is I was honest about the salary issue. I'm like, look, pay, not so great, but I'm not looking for 20 years from you. I'm looking for 2. Instead of, lots of people in this sector are looking to give back. And I said, instead of volunteering to do X, Y, or Z, come work for 2 years. When the 2 years are done, I will help you go somewhere else. And I made that commitment to people. I just kept on getting up in meetups, and I ended up getting some remarkable hires. at that point. And there were people coming, like one guy came out of Groupon, one was a senior guy coming from PwC. I brought my first epi over already from the budget office. There was a lot of success in hitting the ground, which the other commissioners were like, so a commissioner is going out to meetups and doing that. With that being said, I found ways to make the technology more interesting. A traditional, I don't know the details sort of in your agency, the traditional way of thinking about things is if you're going to change a system, you needed to replace the underlying system. What I found, especially in the analytics space, was that wasn't pragmatic. So I started building around things, accepting existing architecture, building new on top, extracting. So like, I'm trying to avoid this turning into a tech talk, but if you're going to do some smart data work, you have that core there, the octopus going out into the legacy, bringing it together and building something really smart on top. It actually proves to be very low cost and very fast, and I was able to get some sort of talent in there for some early wins. It took a lot of work though. Like I was out there every night.
I think from the university side, we won't really know until the first group graduates, and the first group is enrolling this fall, and we'll see. But I can tell you just from looking at the applications and participating in the selection of the first group, there are a lot of people who want to do this. As Brett said, there's a lot of people who actually are driven to come, and their goal is to go work in government when they're done, not to go and work for Facebook. Because the truth is, there's tons of programs out there. I mean, if you're a person and your goal is to go work in Google or Facebook, this isn't really necessarily the best program for you, because there's some that won't make you learn education policy along the way or anything else, right? You'll just go and you'll get that great job. So I think there is a big demand of people. Some of these people are coming from other jobs. Some of these people already work in government and say, I want these skills and I want to go back into it. Others work in the for-profit world and say, I want to change my path. So at this point, I'm hopeful. One never knows until they graduate and see two different salaries being offered to them and have to make a choice. But as we say here today, which is easy to say given that they haven't started yet, I'm very optimistic in their futures.
I think I have the mic. This is Chicago. If you have all this transparency, how is it possible to hide money and have slush funds? And, have you done anything? Has your work done anything about the notorious practices of that?
So, I kid about Chicago's history, but it is what it is. Now, I think there are certain things that we did that directly address this. One, and then I'll get at the problem at the end. One is the city's checkbook. Okay, so at the end of the day, the city has a checkbook. It's a very expensive checkbook. It's called an ERP system, but every check that goes out the door, we publish online in a machine readable, downloadable, all the things. There's transparency on the financials. Now, one of the things I learned, and it's just I think we can use a crime example also, is when you start dumping out large amounts of data, that doesn't mean people are looking at it. And I'll borrow an example from the crime case where, so we put out the 5 million rows of data, and it hit the AP because it was such a big story, Chicago being transparent, right? And a reporter calls, and the reporter asks what question? Well, can you just summarize the story for me? I don't want to look at the data. So we've put out all the it's a former we. So all the financial data is out there. I encourage people to look at it, to use it. If you're going to encourage and prevent acts like that, it requires a full cycle. The fact that we have 500 data sets up there is meaningless unless it's actually utilized. So it's hard to answer the question. Like, you can be transparent, you can put it out, but we'll see if it helps. Has there been, have we had a big thing in the past couple of years? No. But people need to look at the data.
Hi, I'm curious about the impact on the university. So if Dean Boyer came to you and said, "You're king for a day. I want to make University of Chicago to civic data as Stanford is to startups. We want this to be, the place that does this well." What would you change? What would you do differently? Maybe start with the core and then, expand out from there.
We were just sort of talking about that just before the.
It would be great if you could help us flesh this out.
Because we can each throw out some ideas. So first of all, we don't have the answer. We happen to have been talking about your very question before you came in. Unfortunately, we didn't get far. I think king for a day is a good thought experiment. But the way we start is much more incremental, and I think we've started the right way. Thus far, this is very faculty-driven, which I think at a place like Chicago is very essential. I don't think it could work with some king for a day coming in to tell the faculty, here's what the university is going to be. That's probably the way to guarantee that that's not what the university will be. But I do think there are probably some subtle things that we could do, and it will, I think, move. I think the way in which we teach technical skills could probably change. So I teach mainly grad students. I want to be careful how I describe the training for undergrads, but I think probably thinking about the role for computer science in the core could change, and people learning some of the skills I think that could become part of the core, so that if you came out as a University of Chicago undergrad, you knew data science at some level, at the level of being able to do the sort of things Brett and I have been describing, which is say acquire data, right, which requires some computational knowledge, understand what kind of questions to ask out and how to answer them using appropriate statistical techniques. I firmly believe that's all teachable to undergraduates in it does not require half of their courses. So that's how I would change it, is to come up with a data science in the core track, which I bet in the course of 3 courses as a foundation, with then even a major. So one possibility is this, what we've been talking about is a graduate degree, a master's degree. I think there's an undergraduate major analogy here, which could work as well. Those are my thoughts, but I think getting it into the core, as you kind of alluded to in your talk, would be essential. And I think it's doable.
So I'd provide, I think that makes complete sense. When I look at the question from more of a strategic point of view, I think we need to encourage people to work on sort of small wins, where sometimes in this environment you want to solve the big problem. And I know that culture. Coming from the startup culture, you want to have the big win. You want to have the big IPO, all of these things. Now, with that being said, I think there's a lot of opportunity at U of C for a center of gravity in this sort of civic space. And I found that small improvements have huge impact, both from the community to political to the press to all of those. Case in point, going back to the financial data, annually they spend between $8 to $9 billion, right? If you're going to read some of the literature, it talks about that there's often in an ERP, a financial system, single-digit % error in payment. Wow. You write a little code that finds that error, you're going to feel pretty good in an $8 to $9 billion system, right? You find ways to shave off a little optimality in 311 data, huge impact. Going back to my prior life, you find a way to decrease homicides by 3%. That's a bunch of people who don't die. But sometimes these problems seem too small. So I think we need to find a way, and I think that's where we get some of the hybrid between sort of faculty and fellow, where we can bring in some of these problems, we give some new skills, and get some of those rapid wins that help build that center of gravity.
I'm curious as to what your thoughts are in terms of sort of the ethics of this kind of stuff, because I know if you have a bunch of data scientists and you have them go work for government, and maybe the city of Chicago wants to reduce their crime rate, and you're going to have these people that are using machine learning techniques and trying to predict maybe areas of crime, and the blurriness between sort of like classifying to help analyze your data and then stereotyping or just the ethics in general, and your thoughts on that, and if your program addresses that kind of thing.
Well, why don't I give a problem and then make you give the solution?
Deal.
So when I was at the PD, I worked on a problem, which I found very, very interesting. The idea was, who would be shot? Could you develop a prediction technique to identify from a list of people, would they be shot or killed? Now, that's a reasonable problem to work on. Now, when you solve that problem, though, it has a partner problem to it. It has who will kill. And that opens up a can of worms. Because the challenge you run into is you develop the math that can work that tell you things that you don't know what to do with. And I think that technology is racing ahead so fast in this space. Chris talked about all of the sensor data. Like, that's enormous. Like, we could spend hours talking about all of the signal that comes in that, wow, we now know how to conquer that. And now it says, Nikki in front here has a 70% chance of killing someone in the next 24 months. What do you do with that? Like, that's just like, that's something that used to just be in the movies. But science has brought that to the front. So how do we solve that, Chris?
So I have two responses that are mildly satisfying, perhaps. I think, so first of all, this is not a new problem in any way. I think it is going to be a more frequently encountered problem as a result of the technology and availability of data, but these problems in the policy world have existed, always exist. And so even in the medical world, think of various medical tests that we develop that can tell somebody you have some fatal disease. Should you tell the person? Should you not tell them? Profiling certainly is something that's existed long before any kind of ability to do facial recognition, just as an example. So I think it's a familiar problem. That's either good or bad depending on how well you think we've dealt with it to date. I think the most reassuring thing I can say is that in this program that we're talking about, where we're going to train students, we are training people on the ethical side and on the policy side, whereas historically many people coming strict from a technology side have probably not been trained into how to think about this. And that doesn't mean they'll think about it wrongly, but it means there may be lots of these issues that you wouldn't think about at all. And so we have some way, within the world of policy analysis, there are sort of accepted and standard ways of thinking about these kind of trade-offs and doing cost-benefit analyses and things like that. There are problems with those and critics of them, but students will come out being trained in how to think about these problems. But there is no magic answer to them, but we'll at least be thoughtful about them.
Well, this is a very interesting development. Thank you for your efforts. I was just curious if you could maybe share a little bit more about actually the curriculum itself in this program, and maybe how you prioritize different things within it. Just as an example, how heavy is it on, say, the analysis of data versus, say, how heavy on, say, the data preparation or assembling the data, and that is sort of as an emerging discipline.
Yeah, so as for the curriculum and how do we compromise, the answer, and I think, which is the great Chicago answer, is we didn't compromise at all. We from Harris got together with our colleagues at the computer science department and said, all right, we both agreed sort of on the basic agenda that we would like to train. It was a good idea to train students that had both these, and so we both sat down with our core curricula and our respective disciplines and said, this is what we require people to take if they want to get a master's from Harris, and they said, well, this is what we require people to take in CS, and then we each said, well, what would you be willing to give up? And we both said nothing, and so we have that degree. And I think it's a fabulous degree. I think it speaks well of who we are, who the university is. What it means is you take a lot of required courses. It means that if you come out with this degree, you'll have taken the same course someone got, strictly speaking, a computer science degree, the same course someone who took a Harris degree. So this is not a half-assed degree. It's like double-cheeked, full-on, full-ass degree. And that's how we want it. Now, as to the specifics of what's in it, what does that mean? Okay, so in Harris, the core is stats, microeconomics, and what we call political economy, which is sort of the policy-making process. We gave up one of those. Usually you have to take 9, we gave up 1. On the computer science side, there is a core in like CS and applications, which is a combination of programming, database management, and machine learning. So that's their sort of respective cores. They'll do in Harris they'll do stats, micro, and political economy. In CS, they're going to do basically programming, they're going to do databases, and they're going to do machine learning. That consumes of a sort of effectively a 6-quarter a degree, a 2-year, 3 quarters each degree. That consumes 5.5, and then they have the remainder to specialize in something, which could be as I said, a policy thing. They get really interested in crime, they'll take some additional courses in crime, or they get really interested in machine learning, they'll do that. In addition, you ask about applications, how much of it is maybe more technical versus applied. We have two points in which we inject some realism into the program. One is there's a capstone course where they're going to do an actual project. So we have will have either an internal or external client with a real project that the students will work on as sort of their capstone course. And then we're setting up a variety of summer internships so that in the year between the first and second, the summer in between the first and second years, they will take an actual internship in the field, either with the public sector or private sector agency to do stuff. So that's how we've set it up, and it's on. If you want to see the actual list of courses, it's on the website. And it's up there.
I think we're going to have to make this the last question.
Okay. I was wondering a little bit more, or if you could talk a little bit more about datafication and sort of passive data collection, and how much of a component that was in terms of what you were doing with Chicago, and also how well you think it's being utilized right now by within the government.
So going with the last part first, I feel like in general data is underutilized, because data has gone from being small and narrow and where we had traditional classical approaches to now it is copious. So one of the things that we were successful at is being able to bring it together and keep everything. And that's one of the things where in like 90 days, the whole landscape changes. So how do you go from relatively small, maybe multivariate sort of analyses to, oh my God, I can have as many variables as I want. And so I feel like we're early on in this space. And there's also a relatively small number of people that can operate intelligently in this, which sort of goes as to why we need to academically pick it up. Now, going into sort of the passive data and sort of sensor piece, this is high speed at this point. A recent piece came out about Project Charlie Catlett from the CI, who's also involved with Harris, who's someone I frequently partner with, is we're developing the idea for some sensors in Chicago and what that would look like. And the fact that if you think about all the signal that's out there now, it's enormous. And we're starting to be able to retain it. So I think for the time being, we're really going to be fighting to get people up to speed and develop new techniques. And the amount of data we have will surpass that. But that's what the next couple of years are going to look like. But as we get more talent into this space, as there's more initiatives that I think we'll see in the private sector that will hopefully leverage into the public sector, which, one thing I will drop that I should have said earlier on is government better leveraging open source techniques. And many of the things, and usually I include this in sort of the preamble, everything from one of the things that was funny in Chicago is they said, well, it's too expensive for us to do advanced analytics because we can't afford X modeling package. Well, many of you know about things like R, an open source package. There's plenty on GitHub these days which you can get on and use, and honestly is better than the commercial piece. So all of these things tied together, so hopefully over the next couple of years we'll see a catch up. But there's a lot to learn, there's a lot to do.
No, I agree.
So as a non-University of Chicago alum, I've admired this great university from afar, and like really far away in terms of my ability to study here. And I've always wondered what it was about the university that I was missing and what made it so special. And we've all heard a lot about it. And it's great to learn today that it's really that double-cheeked, full-assed scholarship that makes this place
that part
so
wasn't
special.
On here.
And I now realize what I've been missing. And I'm sure
it's never too late to get your second cheek.
Well, I'm sure the university archivist will enjoy hearing this one. So thanks, Chris and Brett. If you can join me in a round of applause, please. For those who are staying around tomorrow and want more of this double cheek scholarship, we at Harris are presenting our first annual alumni awards. We're presenting awards to Beth Swanson, who's a Harris alumna and is the Deputy Chief of Staff for Education for the City of Chicago. So Beth will talk a little bit about her work at the city after she receives her award. And Dan Tangerlini, also, of course, a Chicago Harris alumnus, and he is the administrator for the General Services Agency in Washington, D.C. And finally, a Dean's Award to Mayor Karen Freeman Wilson, the city of Gary. For those who aren't familiar, Harris is doing a remarkable project with the city of Gary under the leadership of former Chicago Mayor Daley, and we'll be honoring Mayor Karen Freeman Wilson for her work on that project. So we'd welcome you to join us for those awards tomorrow afternoon beginning at 2:30 at Chicago Harris. If you're not familiar, it's at 60th and Woodlawn, so you're welcome to attend. Thanks very much.